Hello. Ask yourself the question, what happens to supply and producer surplus when innovations increase productivity among all producers? Think about it. First effect on the supply curve is it will cause a parallel shift, and we can see that up here by changing the intercept, C. And so it increases consumer surplus, decreases producer surplus. But at first it increases producer surplus. We'll talk about that in a second. So let's bring it up here again. Here's producer surplus getting really small, that blue area, and the purple area. Let's stop it a second, take it back. So here we have it where the supply curve is so high that the equilibrium price is so high people won't buy any. So let's start having some innovation that equally affects the lowest cost producers over here and the highest cost producers over here. Let's go and change our intercept. So here we go. Their consumer surplus is getting bigger, 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 keeps on going up. Producer surplus looks like it's getting bigger. Then we start getting inelastic, and eventually producer surplus starts going down. Well, what are some examples in the real world where you have parallel shifts in the supply curve? Well, some examples include high-yielding crop varieties, fertilizers, pesticides. This is actually one of the things that started the Green Revolution. Likewise, changes in crop rotation has increased productivity of the fields that are not as productive and also the very productive fields. Likewise, variable rate technologies that measure soil nutrients in agriculture to give specific nutrients. Innovations in the corn ethanol industry and many other innovations can cause this parallel shift. So here we have our demand curve where A is the intercept up here at 40, B is the slope, C is the intercept for the supply curve, E is the slope of the supply curve. The supply curve is elastic when C, the intercept for the supply curve up here, is positive. So here I have a positive intercept and the supply curve is elastic. When the intercept is 0, the supply curve is unit elastic. When the supply curve's intercept is less than 0, then the supply curve is inelastic. When the slope is 0, the slope of the supply curve, that is 0, the producer surplus is 0, everything's consumer surplus, and also the supply curve is horizontal and is perfectly elastic. I'm not going to draw it, but the supply curve would be vertical when the elasticity or when the slope is infinity, and it would be a vertical supply curve for a perfectly inelastic supply, which would be elasticity equal to 0. And producer surplus would equal total revenue in this case. So all of total revenue would be producer surplus. Innovations that cause parallel shifts in a linear supply curve are going to reduce the supply elasticity. So let's show that. So here we are elastic when it's positive. And we're going to come down here to unit elastic. And there it is. And then inelastic. So here's our innovations causing the supply elasticity to decrease. When looking at the demand elasticity up here on a straight line demand curve is elastic, unit elastic, and then inelastic. With respect to total revenue, when total revenue is increasing as the price decreases, this upward portion of the total revenue curve is elastic. When it reaches a maximum, total revenue is at the maximum point. And then when total revenue starts declining over here, let's move this up. When total revenue starts declining from our maximum point down to here, our demand curve is inelastic. Now let's look at producer surplus. So let's click up here under our parallel shifts So producer surplus. So there's our producer surplus. And let's also show our current producer surplus, which will be straight below here. There it is. And let's also show our maximum producer surplus. Actually, red point, there is our maximum. And I'm actually going to draw a line that will show all of our producer surpluses. Just for simplicity, let's take that off right now. So there's our maximum point. And what we see is that up here, up to an inflection point, that producer surplus increases at an increasing rate in the elastic portion. And let's take this to C up here. That is C to 0, I should say. And it looks like that unit elastic point is about where we have our inflection point. So increasing producer surplus at an increasing rate. Then it starts decreasing. And let's actually change this to a -5, let's say. And so there we are we're still increasing producer surplus, but at a decreasing rate. So what we see here is producer surplus increases at an increasing rate in the elastic portion of the demand curve when C is greater than 0. Then we have an inflection point, as we just saw, when C was equal to 0. So there is our inflection point right there. And then in the inelastic range, when C is less than 0, producer surplus increases up here, reaches a maximum, and then starts to head down until price is 0, and we have 0 producer surplus. Also notice that when we have a negative intercept, so we don't count this area of this big triangle that's below the intercept because we assume you don't charge a price below 0. And so we can just call that as, with a linear supply curve, negative intercept. Part of the triangle is in this lower quadrant, in this negative quadrant, and that does not count. And what that means is as we move down here, a bigger and bigger portion of the producer surplus is pushed down to the negative quadrant, which means the producer surplus gets smaller and smaller. When the supply slope E is perfectly elastic, there is no producer surplus. And in fact, let's play that. So what happens? Oops, doesn't want to go down there. So in this case, it really doesn't like that. But as the intercept starts coming down, there's never going to be any producer surplus, but we can move down along here as the intercept moves down. As the supply slope increases, it becomes more inelastic, the producer surplus curve will shift upwards. In fact, let's click on this case on our red line. Let's make our E a little bit higher. But let's actually play this line here. So here we are changing. Now in this case, this would be just changing the slope. So notice most inelastic, steeper curve. In fact, let's slow this down a little bit. So as the overall elasticity curve becomes flatter, less and less producer surplus is available. So if it's vertical, almost everything is total revenue. If it's perfectly elastic, everything, there's no producer surplus anywhere. So, and interestingly enough, the maximum point always is along a straight line between the maximum point of total revenue and the where total revenue is equal to zero, the maximum output, when there's zero producer surplus and everything's consumer surplus. So in other words, the maximum points, as we saw here, is along a line that lies between the top of the total revenue curve and the ends at the bottom right corner of the total revenue curve. In other words, even though total revenue is declining, producer surplus is increasing into this area where you have less and less total revenue. Well, what happens to consumer surplus? Let's click on consumer surplus up here. And consumer surplus, notice, always increases. So there it is, consumer surplus always increases. So here I move down our line a little bit here, that is, increase the slope, and which increasing the slope of the supply curve, making it flatter, made it also so our maximum points down here. Here's our consumer surplus increasing though. Well, the next question is, what happens to total surplus? Well, remember that total surplus is equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Let's click over here to show total surplus. So here it is, must start at zero for our total surplus. Let's bring up that. So, and then our consumer surplus is increasing at an increasing rate at all times. Producer surplus is increasing at an increasing rate until about here. And then starts increasing at a decreasing rate, reaches a maximum, and then starts declining. And so our total surplus increases, and then start up here somewhere, it starts increasing at a decreasing rate. And then this point up here, total surplus is equal to consumer surplus because there is no producer surplus. That's a mouthful, isn't it? Or as we just said, total surplus reaches a maximum when the price is zero. Or as we already said, when supply is perfectly inelastic, all revenue is producer surplus up here. When supply elasticity is not perfectly elastic or inelastic, total surplus increases at an increasing rate up to where the supply is unit elastic, as we showed already, increases up at an increasing rate up to, this is right below there, but it looks like right above here where we have a unit supply curve, and then starts total surplus, and I should say total surplus, that's true, and then total surplus then increases at a decreasing rate. Right here, it starts increasing at a decreasing rate because of that decreasing, and because producer surplus isn't increasing as it was before. And consumer surplus and total surplus are maximized right up here, where there is no producer surplus. In other words, the good is free. It's not a scarce good anymore. In fact, notice this innovations that cause our supply intercept to fall, these parallel shifts. And let's slow it down. Notice it's causing prices to go closer and closer to the origin. So in other words, in a competitive market, all innovations benefit consumers. Consumer surplus is always increasing. Likewise, a lower elasticity of supply relative to the demand tends to increase the share of society's gains going to producers. So producers like to have fairly inelastic supply curves. And so innovations causing rightward parallel shifts in supply, lower producer surplus, which reduces the supply elasticity. And in competitive markets, innovations increase the sum of producer and consumer surpluses regardless of the type of producers that adopt them. In other words, society's better off and consumers are better off. Good to talk to you.